Marissa, Alan. So thank you for coming out tonight to the opening and celebration of the exhibition New Soviet People Will Conquer Cosmic Space, which is predominantly a project of my good friend Dean Simpson, and I will introduce him shortly. But some of you have wandered through the show, and so I just want to make a couple of comments about it. All of you probably know Chapter 32 of McLuhan's Understanding Media, called Weapons, in which he describes the effect of sending Valentina Tereshkova into space, essentially with no pilot's training. And so McLuhan offers two readings of this. The first is that the Russians have somehow cunningly understood that the way to undermine the American male-dominated military space apparatus is to send this female into space. The second reading is that Valentina is sent to the West and is offered as a little Valentine or heartthrob suited to our sentimentality. And so whatever we make of this specific interpretation of McLuhan's, I think he gets something right in the way that he understands the Soviet space program as a system of messages. And he understands it predominantly in the way you expect McLuhan to think of messages, as a warfare of imagery. But the second reading of a system of messages is also interesting, which is that the evolution of computation and digitization in Russia essentially followed from the early space program, which is to say that the heartthrob came first and cybernetics came later. And thirdly, that the system of messages is a system of messages which Dean Simpson's exhibition picks up on, which is that the consolidation and the formulation of this particular mythology of the cosmonaut combines shoes, telephones, veils, and orbit trajectories within the same register of interpretation. Or the mythology of the cosmonaut produces a space in which the Valentine's card and the technical apparatuses for space training share an equivalency. And it is in this sense that the project of the New Soviet People Conquer Cosmic Space falls into a series of exhibitions we've been doing around the question of architecture's engagement with media practices. And I think it's Dean's incredibly astute reading of the subtle manipulations of message systems within this work that makes that relationship to the other exhibitions so potent. And so for an exhibition like this, there are always many people to thank. First, I would like to thank Dean Wigley for his ongoing support of these experiments, which always end up being much costlier in terms of money and time than anyone ever imagined. And I'd like to thank the exhibitions crew who put in an incredible effort into the realization and installation, especially Daniel Payne and Annie Coombs. And especially, of course, I'd like to thank Dean Simpson for agreeing to do this project and for devoting an incredible amount of time to its realization. I know Dean from having worked together with him essentially side by side for a while at Diller and Scofidio, and so the narrative I've been telling people for a long time is that Dean's maniacally fetishistic, obsessive attitude, which is exhibited in this exhibition, I assumed came from the imperatives of working in that office, but it turns out that they're all his own. And I think the exhibition is evidence of that. But for those of you who do not know Dean, Dean is from New Zealand, where he was trained as an architect. He then came to Columbia, where he did a graduate degree in architecture. And he has since gone to the ETH in Zurich, where he is a doctoral candidate, and where he has taught a number of courses. Sorry, I don't have the list, in which the courses which Dean has involved in are explained. But so he has a long, complex, and varied practice, which involves design, it involves scholarship, and involves teaching, and now involves curating and producing his own projects in tandem and with us here. And so thank you so much, Dean, for agreeing to do this project and coming here tonight.
Thank you, Mark, also for your great fortitude and perseverance throughout this project. I'm going to talk about two things. Firstly, a little bit about the research that formed the background to the exhibition, and also then kind of talk a little bit about the exhibition itself. I also just want to echo Mark's kind of acknowledgement of people who helped out and For sure, this project would not have been possible without the help of the crew here. But I also want to acknowledge the work of Johan Strarup and Ida Richter Brandstrup, who in Copenhagen produced a massive amount of work and were involved heavily in the production of the models and the work. So it would not have been possible without them. And also to thank Dean Wigley for the support of the exhibition. So I just sort of want to put a little bit of background in why the Soviet space program for me, and I'm going to kind of do a terrible thing and show a student project I did at Columbia 12 years ago, which is to try to kind of explain where my interest in this theme of the Soviet space program developed, which for me was kind of about the intersection of ergonomics, man-machine systems, and cybernetics. And this work was mostly addressing the scale of the body, where I started to study the simulation apparatuses that were used by the various space programs to kind of train astronauts and cosmonauts. And I was interested in them less in terms of simulation and much more in terms of actual effects that were produced on the body and of the body. So this is just kind of one project which was kind of intervention between the scale of furniture and kind of interior, which was trying to recomposite various arrangements from these apparatuses. So you can see on the top up here, for example, this was actually a kind of fluid immersion system where a cosmonaut would be immersed inside of a fluid for up to a week or 2 weeks at a time to kind of give them a sense of weightlessness. Another one that I was looking at was high pressure suit systems that would also change the way the body would kind of be as a kind of mobile apparatus. And I was looking at ways to combine them into these objects, and these were just experiments developed to kind of test this thing out. So at the end of this kind of period studying here, I was very lucky to have a fellowship to go and do research, and I proposed to go to Russia and do further research into this type of kind of phenomenon. And what I found out was that around this time, it was increasingly kind of feasible, which was around the mid-90s, to access what had been previously kind of top secret sites that were closed sites to the West, but also to the media. And around this sort of period of the mid-90s, of course, there had been a substantial drop in government funding for the space program in the Soviet Union. There was a Russian economic crisis in which the ruble was severely devalued. And basically, the people who were in control of this material started to realize that this material had a value and could kind of obtain a price. And so what I became aware of increasingly, this is just an image actually from a Sotheby's auction, I think it was 96, there was another one 2 years earlier, where it was actually a sale of Russian space hardware. And so what I organized, and I went to Russia in 1998 on this SOM fellowship together with Fiona Witten, and through a series of contacts that grew out of a series of telephone calls, of which this gentleman on the bottom right here, his name is Grigory Khrushchev, who was our translator, allowed us or helped us to get access to these sites. And what became very interesting to me was the level to which we were operating in the kind of informal sector of the economy in these kinds of negotiations. More or less, you would arrive at a place and have to kind of hand over an envelope with a certain amount of American dollars. And so this was kind of a very interesting process in terms of kind of developing research. So I went there to very much kind of continue this interest in kind of looking through the lens of how these apparatuses through which the cosmonaut was trained construct a particular form of body, a particular form of movement that could be understood as a small-scale architecture in which this kind of man-machine system is produced. And this is just one example of a place that I went to called the Institute for Biomedical Problems, where there are very many very strange experiments that take place. Another place that I visited, for example, was an organization called Zvezda, which is the state-owned bureau for producing spacesuits, but also pressure suits for the Russian Air Force. So this organization, this is just an image from the museum there. It's still very much a part of the military-industrial complex, and we were picked up in a van that was kind of parked outside a metro station, and we were taken kind of to a place that we didn't know where we were being taken. They refused to tell us where their location was, and so on. So this was a very kind of interesting and exciting adventure in Russia. Also, you can see here another example of a location that we went to, which was an archive. We went to a number of archives. This holds most of the scientific information for the space program from the 1950s. And this was actually exactly how it looked in 1998. And they were also very low on resources. But what was, I think, very interesting is that this archive was still understood within this kind of culture as something very, very important and very valuable. For example, they were only just starting to convert this material to video, and it was really a kind of quite a challenging process to find the information and get access to it. Another important site that we were able to get into is a place called Star City, which is on the outskirts of Moscow, which is both the place where cosmonauts are living and also where they're trained. And from the 1960s, when it was built, this was really a secret town, which was more or less hidden from the maps. And only kind of in the late, I could say mid-70s, did this become more a kind of a known place. And only really from the late 80s was it more publicly accessible. And it was very interesting to kind of go here also from the point of view of my own research, because we were able to obviously see all of these training devices and apparatuses, from centrifuges to various kinds of simulators, buoyancy tanks, and so on. And I think what was very interesting also is sort of a little bit of the scale and the sort of sense of kind of technological sublime in these spaces. This is where actually they would play tennis and badminton on either side of this centrifuge when it was not being used. It was a really kind of remarkable place. Another place that we visited was a lot of the official museums and their associated archives, which I think what was very interesting about them was really how the state presented and authorized the kind of presentation of the space program. Unfortunately, most of these museums, I think as you probably get a sense of from the image, were really about a kind of orgy of technological hardware for space. And from my point of view, it was less interesting, and it was very much about trying to present a kind of technological level of perfection from this period. So while kind of looking at all of these various training devices and being a little bit focused on that, what I started to see more and more, and I became increasingly interested in what I was there, is the kind of both the pervasiveness and the intensity of the cultural production surrounding this program. So not only is it the sort of small scientific adventure that's kind of locked away in different places, but wherever you go there, I think you have some sense of this event, and there are memorials and various forms of kind of material evidence of the space program. These are just two examples: the Cosmonaut Memorial in Moscow and Gagarin Square on the right-hand side, with these kind of huge titanium monuments. This is just an example of this typical kind of imagery, which is all about a kind of advancement, conquest of space, kind of collective cause toward kind of the overcoming of nature. And this was also, of course, present in boulevards. This is a metro station on the right-hand side. There are places kind of everywhere that kind of show these kinds of imagery, this imagery. And what I also became very interested in is that not only is this cultural production in this public space, but there are also these various shrines, which are very, very interesting and quite remarkable. This is actually the Gagarin Rooms in Star City, which is a museum in which on the right-hand side is the frozen desk of Yuri Gagarin, who died in, I think, 1968. And the desk is left exactly as it was left when he left to fly on his last mission in an aircraft. The clock is stopped at exactly the time that he died. There's really this sort of sense of production of a shrine. On the left-hand side also you see the jacket with medals and so on. So in a way, it's very interesting that Star City was described by many people as a theme park of communism. And this kind of association with Star City is very strong in Moscow, where it's understood still as kind of maintaining many of the kind of visions and ideologies connected still to the communist regime. And this kind of also in these museums is very interesting, the kind of collection of objects, how they're presented. These are gifts given to Gagarin by various foreign dignitaries. It's a jackhammer fountain pen, a miniature chainsaw, and Gagarin kind of Ming vase. These shrines are scattered everywhere. This is a shrine of Gagarin's car in Smolensk, which is in a beautiful kind of glass building. The shrine where Gagarin slept the night before he went into space with his jacket inside of a glass vitrine. So really, I became kind of increasingly aware of the importance of this event, of kind of placing a human in space as a critical moment in Soviet history. I think for me that was quite a surprising experience when I was there. It was much more present and powerful than I expected. So I think in that sense it's quite important to put this event in context, both historically and politically. And according to official representations, just as the arrival of the steam engine represented the maturation of capitalism during the Industrial Revolution, the conquest of space, the Soviet leadership argued, announced a new scientific technological revolution aligned to this notion of the maturation of socialism. And this event marked kind of the perfection of communism. And in this kind of three-part schema, socialism, of course, is referring to what Engels describes as a kind of intermediary or temporary stage prior to which communism is achieved, which is the kind of perfect form of this kind of Leninist Marxist ideal. And according to the official representation, this event actually was given equal importance to as the 1917 revolution. During this period, more or less, it was aligned as being equally important to the discovery of the New World by Columbus. It was also at this time by various reporters described as important as finding or inventing the steam engine or the printing press. So there's this really kind of powerful sense in hindsight of the kind of the mass importance applied to this event. And of course, this kind of narrative was very, very convenient and very, very advantageous, of course, to Khrushchev at this time, because both it kind of offers a way of reinforcing this idea of a nuclear deterrent. It also offers a kind of point of attraction internationally, especially during a period in which post-colonialism was kind of gearing up, as well as using it as a justification of the success of his policies in relation to a conservative military, as well as a kind of indicator, obviously, of the superiority of Soviet science and technology. So this kind of superiority was very much used as a kind of political ploy by Khrushchev, to which he would identify himself personally. And of course, when Khrushchev came into power, he very much was trying to mark himself as a different form of leader to Stalin. This kind of term to describe the beginning of his power period was described as the thaw, in which he kind of denounced this cult of personality in terms of the way that Stalin would present himself in various forms of propaganda representations. And what Khrushchev was able to do using the space program effectively was to exploit the space program through an association. So rather than Khrushchev replacing Stalin in these images, effectively, in this case, Gagarin and cosmonauts took over this role in this kind of traditional form of agitprop media. So more or less the content of the cult of personality shifted during this period from Stalin to the cosmonaut. And in that kind of context, the cosmonaut became the embodiment of this revolutionary moment, the second revolution after 1917, in which the revolution was, of course, marked emblematically by this figure, the cosmonaut, as a kind of idealized subject. And of course, many of the videos that you would see out there are all about this kind of association between Khrushchev and Gagarin, which is much more explicit, I think, in the video material that we have there, which is mostly taken from propaganda films and also from television footage, than the images that I showed just before, which is this sort of more traditional form of media. And we can say for sure that these media representations are highly sort of aestheticized and choreographed. They're incredibly constructed as official representations of this kind of idealized human subject, which in this case, of course, is Gagarin. And conveniently, or I would say, of course, it's probably a matter of design, that this kind of perfection of the subject also aligns perfectly through Gagarin's biography to the various kind of stages of evolution of the Soviet subject. So in this case, The pre-revolutionary peasants are kind of aligning to Gagarin's parents during the Lenin period, in which this kind of subject was, of course, the factory worker as well as the peasant, through to the third stage, in which Gagarin, of course, was also an aviator, of which Stalin, of course, was the personal kind of mentor, personal patron of aviation in the Soviet Union, and of course the Khrushchev period on the right, where Gagarin is seen as cosmonaut. And so I think it's interesting for me that having been there, I sort of was not only interested in this sort of one side, which was the sort of training aspect, but also in how the sort of representation kind of project was developed. And I think while we, of course, can be quite skeptical of these kinds of kind of constructs and so on, I think what also is very interesting actually is a certain kind of level of utopian energy attached to this project, even though, of course, a lot of it is orchestrated by the state apparatus. So in a way, when you go through a lot of these archives and in these museums, in parts of them there's really remarkable kind of collections of paintings, remarkable objects that are kind of outside a little bit of this typical official structure. This is a series of paintings which are all attached to a kind of museum around, this is in Kaluga actually, the State Museum. So there are also these kinds of images which have arguably also been staged, but I think when you go to locations such as some of the museums, this is actually the State Museum, Memorial Museum of Cosmonautics in Moscow, where you get this kind of very trippy and bizarre kind of expressionistic and almost sort of ecclesiastic kind of representation of the program and the project of conquering space. So it's sort of somehow a trippy kind of combination of kind of high-tech orgy, almost a kind of David Rockwell-esque theater production, combined with this sort of almost on the top right kind of stained glass ecclesiastical architecture. So in a way, while we can say for sure that these activities, this sort of manned or human space project was somehow a cul-de-sac of the 20th century, it's very interesting also to start to try to interpret what that means, rather than the project of going into space, but to start to understand what that means as a project that is what Mark and I are referring to as the terrestrial cosmonaut. So this diagram is just to really show the sort of three phases of cosmonaut formation. On the bottom left is training, the top one is flight, and the bottom right is this kind of post-period representation or presentation. And what I think the topic or the kind of project of interest in this case is less to say that the space program is all about going into space. In this context, it's about focusing on these kind of terrestrial aspects that are about producing actually an idealized human subject, and the notion that this idealized human subject is constructed through a vast series of objects and kind of circuits of meaning, as Mark suggested, things that combine objects such as shoes, centrifuges, jackets, and so forth. So that kind of leads into the exhibition, which kind of deals with a kind of very kind of basic and simple separation of these two aspects, the kind of training on the lower part, and then this sort of presentation complex on the right. And that aligns more or less in a way to the way the Soviet space program was organized. So we can think, for example, of Kamenin, who's the director we see there in the middle right, who was in charge of training. We see Khrushchev on the top, who obviously was ultimately responsible for the agitprop information, and on the bottom is Korolev, who is the designer of the space system. So it's really about, I think, a negotiation or a dialogue between the two gentlemen on the upper half of the image. So Mark and I were talking about developing this exhibition, and we were kind of discussing how to kind of go about doing that. And one idea was to really work, of course, with the video footage as a sort of as the document that we would work from, the kind of evidence of this formation of the cosmonaut, and we would develop a series of more or less models that would actually start to register and actually form some kind of catalog of objects that were kind of involved seriously in this formation. And just to give you a little bit of background, this is the process for producing some of these models where we would be working from video stills. And then in this case, Johan would develop a 3D model we see in the middle, and then this program Pipicura would unfold them. So we developed this kind of extremely time-consuming and kind of, as Mark said, maybe a little bit maniacal process of producing these objects, which would ideally kind of set up a dialogue with the video. I just show this slide to actually explain why the color we chose on the vitrines is there. This blue and this green is actually everywhere in the former Soviet Union. You can see here on the left-hand side an image of a schoolroom, and on the right-hand side a photograph from Chernobyl, actually showing one floor in green and one floor in blue. So there was also an attempt to kind of work with some of these kind of color languages that exist also very strongly in the video material. So I'm just going to run through very quickly some of the themes in the video material, some of the work in the exhibition, to try to also maybe put it a little bit in the context of why it might be interesting potentially to architects beyond a discussion only on media. I think, for example, what was very interesting in some of this material was really how these various training apparatuses produce completely altered kind of spatio-temporal conditions in which, in this case, these two gentlemen here in silver suits are walking inside of this inhabitable centrifuge, throwing darts that actually turn 90 degrees in the middle of flight. You also have one guy on the end who's actually standing at 45 degrees, and they're conducting all of these experiments which seem extremely kind of banal, but in this context take on a completely different kind of format. Another very interesting thing that we found out was really how this idea of a space kind of race played out in very interesting forms of kind of ad hoc material arrangements. This is a very important Stalinist skyscraper in Moscow. You probably all know it. It's the University of Moscow, in which in the late 1950s they were using the elevators in this building to test for the effects of weightlessness. So what they would effectively do is drop the elevator from the very, very top of the central tower with a cosmonaut trainee in it, and for around 3 seconds they would be suspended between the floor and the ceiling of the elevator cab. And they would kind of stop the elevator at the bottom with these very specially designed air brakes. But I've been trying, for example, to get hold of the footage of this elevator interiors, but to no avail. But it's very interesting that there are a series of these kinds of ad hoc kind of improvisations, which are kind of in many ways heavily spatial. This is another sort of station in the way we arranged the videos was in a series of stations that deal with a series of themes. This was dealing with the idea of human projectiles, in which effectively to test the effects of ejection systems, cosmonaut trainees were attached literally to rockets and blasted on railway tracks on the left, on rocket poles, and out of airplanes. And I think there's also some quite interesting kind of choreography in the video footage, but it's really talking a lot, I think, in tandem with this kind of equipment, which is tied to very much the idea of the body as an elastic, we can say plastic organism, in which through these various techniques of training, the whole kind of body system would be transformed again into this idealized new Soviet figure. And a lot of these kind of devices are very much about trying to rewire the human nervous system, and there are a number of very explicit descriptions in the kind of training documentation about the idea of retooling and redefining the nervous system as a plastic device. And this is actually a dissection of a nervous system on the left, and on the top right you can see these semicircular canals, which a lot of these devices which are on this previous image were about. So really it's about shaking the body around, about rotating, about jumping. It's all about kind of trying to see what the vestibular apparatus, which defines the human balance perception, how that can be kind of rewired in various ways. And I think there are many kind of other examples of this notion of the body as plastic. And I think we can say also that this plasticity, jumping now a little bit more to the question of the presentation of this new Soviet person, this kind of idea of plasticity, of course, always also extends to the idea of information and how information is presented. This is a photograph on the bottom left, the so-called original of the Sochi series, which is presenting a series of cosmonauts together with Korolev in the center, seated, who is the chief designer, together with the trainers on the right-hand side seated. And of course, you can see here that one cosmonaut has been removed from 3 of the photographs. There were 3 different versions of this photograph, one in which the cosmonaut was replaced with a stair, another one a bush, and a third one a column. And these were kind of revealed in various contexts. And I think that this was very much kind of about presenting a particular vision of how kind of critical it was to present the Soviet space program as a success, and how the entire kind of series of results of the program were kind of filtered through this kind of apparatus. And this is also quite clear, I think, in the other kind of documentation of the events, where you see here Gagarin getting into his blue suit before he goes into space. And there's a very kind of stage sequence where Gagarin is putting his Communist Party membership card in his pocket. And this is really where the scientist or technician behind him is kind of handing over the card. Gagarin is very deliberately taking it and putting it in his pocket, of which, of course, the suit pocket was very specially designed for his Communist Party membership card. Of course, also the telephones. And so each of these objects that you see in the exhibition could be understood, for example, as kind of characters, or as, in a way, kind of inventory of these devices through which this form of subjectivity was produced and kind of transmitted. In this case, this is a very famous conversation between Gagarin and Khrushchev, in which, again, Gagarin is, through association, promoting himself politically, and also he's doing this very explicitly as the father of the cosmonauts. And there are many examples in which the cosmonauts talk about Khrushchev as the space father. Here, for example, also this kind of idea of the way that these kind of celebratory events were staged and choreographed extremely precisely in terms of colors, in terms of composition, camera angles, in terms of who was standing where, who was shaking whose hand. And I think to the extent also, of course, where you see the 3, this kind of holy trinity of figures. On the top left, Lenin, the top right, Khrushchev, and in the middle, slightly lower, of course, is Gagarin. And even this sort of idea of pageantry and the staging of these events is also kind of dealt with very much at an urban scale. Of course, there's a very strong history of agitprop taking place in the city, and the city being transformed with banners and various types of information. This is Gagarin flying in this airliner in the center with 7 Soviet jet fighters escorting him, with Khrushchev filmed overlooking the kind of view above. And what happened in this case, this formation of aircraft was really using the city in the sense that they were flying directly down the main avenues of the city, down Leninsky Prospect, directly over Red Square, up Gorky Street, and then back to the airport, which you see here. So there's this, again, kind of expansion of both ambition and scale of these kind of representations and celebrations. This is also a very important piece of footage which shows Gagarin walking from this aircraft at the airport, in which he has to walk along about an 80-yard red carpet, which is kind of spread out on the tarmac. And you can see in this shot on the left, his shoelace is undone. And this was also debated extensively by the people who were controlling information. It was debated whether this was footage that should be cut out, because it shows this idealized subject as someone who is not really ideal. But it was used eventually for propaganda purposes to show that indeed Gagarin was a man of the people. He was a humble man who also had faults like all of us. Of course, these chains of kind of symbolism and ritual that come out of the Soviet kind of culture also are tied very much to architectural elements. Of course, we all know the Mausoleum of Linen, in which was used very heavily in this kind of celebration. And there was a very interesting piece of description of where Gagarin in his ghost-written autobiography explains how after this event ended, Khrushchev sort of took him closely to him and said, would you like to see Lenin's tomb? So they have this very special moment where father and son go down underneath the mausoleum to see the body of Lenin. And in this kind of autobiography, Gagarin describes how moved he is by this experience. And again, it kind of ties back to this kind of trinity of relations that are promoted, which of course leave out Stalin in this kind of project. Of course, also, as Mark was mentioning from McLuhan's work, this question of Tereshkova, the first woman in space. These are kind of propaganda, or we can say agitprop images, which show kind of very interesting kind of slogans. I think the one on the top left, on the left reads "Long live equal rights to women in the USSR," and the one on the right says "Women fight obsolete traditions, build new socialist life." And this quite interesting, kind of powerful slogans and stuff. And what is interesting also in terms of Tereshkova is the way that she is both kind of continuously both feminized and also connected to, again, a kind of proletarian hereditary. And she was, of course, previously a factory worker, and after she had gone into space, a massive kind of media contingent you see in the background here followed her to the factory, and she staged a kind of day of work at the factory after she had been into space. On the right here, you also see images of kind of painting of her, and here you see also images which are kind of related to some of the video you'll see outside, in which it was seen as very convenient by Khrushchev and very exciting to actually put two of these idealized human beings together. Here you see Tereshkova, the first woman in space, being married to Nikolaev, the third cosmonaut in space. And they, of course, had a space baby, which you see in the middle. And this baby was heavily monitored by Soviet doctors because they were very, very interested to see what the effects of space would be on the reproductive system. So not only did this sort of idea of total design extend from kind of an idea of training cosmonaut and of kind of presenting this cosmonaut in various environments, but also, of course, it extended to this idea of total design as producing almost a kind of continued idealized subject beyond what was already produced. Okay, so I'm going to finish there, just to kind of give you a very kind of quick introduction of some of the ideas and thinking behind the show. Thanks a lot. The story with the deleted cosmonaut is he got in a fight with some police officers at a railway station, and they agreed to do a cover-up, except for what happened was he refused to apologize. So because he refused to apologize, he was kind of ejected from the cosmonaut team. And therefore, it was kind of an embarrassment for them, so they covered it up. Yeah. Yeah, there was I think there is a large group of people who are known as space sleuths, and they make quite an adventure out of tracking down all of these so-called cover-ups. And I think a lot of them have been dispelled as myths that have been constructed. Some of them have been constructed by artists who are kind of playing with this kind of whole idea. But there were a series of kind of cover-ups regarding things like explosions and things that kind of came out later. I mean, I think for me, I was sort of less interested in sort of trying to sort of follow the space sleuth line to say, we're trying to expose the sort of mistruths and so forth that were produced out of the program. And for me, I'm more interested in this sort of space between these kind of two sides in which there's also very much a kind of very optimistic and ambitious aspect to the project. So I kind of was interested to not put too much emphasis on this sort of exposing cover-up, which the space sleuths have put a lot of time and energy into, and for me it's not as interesting as some of the other aspects. Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit about the model making technique as to what the labor of making those models and how that kind of maps over some interpretation or some idea of the construction of the subject in the Soviet space program itself?
I think that these objects, of course, were very time-consuming to produce and involve many steps. And I think in hindsight, perhaps we might not have been as ambitious with how many we had planned to produce, as just one statement. But I think in terms of the models, what I was interested in going around these different museums and these different places in which these kind of objects were being presented in very particular ways. I'm interested in the fact that many of those objects were not the actual objects. Many of them were kind of reproduced, were not authentic. I think many of these sort of science museums where, for example, Leonardo da Vinci Museum in Milan, where there's a kind of science museum in which his sort of inventions have been kind of recreated and reproduced. I think where these objects are not kind of imbued with the aura of the original, I think there's something else that becomes possible in that. And I think, for me, I think maybe when I look back on this project, the question of the labor of producing them will have some kind of very relevant connection. But for me, I think it's more about the ability to kind of produce another kind of catalog or archive of this thing that tries to portray another kind of construct of it without relying upon this notion of aura of the original object. So it's sort of, it's also hard for me to kind of talk about it because Mark and I were talking about this before, that at the beginning I wasn't exactly sure why we were going to build these models. I just I just thought that they were necessary. And I think as it's developed, it's starting to make more sense to me. So I'm not really able maybe to answer your question precisely.
University of Moscow. You say that they used the elevator to go up and down, and they used it to train astronauts. Can you explain that further?
Yeah. Well, it's very similar to what has been developed in some theme parks recently, in which you get dropped more or less from an elevator in which you're in free fall. So you're not being constrained at all by any kind of counterweight. And you're basically being dropped from the very top, and as soon as you get quite close to the bottom, you're stopped with brakes. And more or less in the time that this elevator is free-falling, you're slowly lifting off from the floor. And then in the case in Moscow, there was around, I think, 2 to 3 seconds of weightlessness in which you're actually floating between the floor and the ceiling. And they would actually take cosmonauts through one by one. So there would be one person in this elevator cab. They would drop them, they would bring the elevator up again. And while that was happening, apparently the rest of the building was functioning purely as it would normally. So while you were coming up to your chemistry lecture, Gagarin was dropping down in the elevator next to you. But it's been very hard to try to get footage of this. I had wanted to have one piece of footage of this elevator, but it's somewhere in this pile of canisters that you see in that earlier photograph. there since that trip, which was in '98, and I think, at least from what I have been reading, it seems like the level of nationalism in Russia has kind of increased considerably in recent years. But I mean, I don't. I think that. Are you asking whether I see this project in the context of nostalgia, or if you think that? Yeah, I mean, what I think for sure, I'm attracted to a lot of these aspects that show very much a different kind of understanding of the relationship between a kind of how design is understood, and I think in the way that I think this program is working is this sort of idea that total design is somehow possible and desirable, and I think this is a very interesting kind of concept. I'm not saying necessarily that it's one that we should be striving for, but I think it's a very interesting example in which the ambitions of design are expanded to such a kind of extent that something else happens to design. Design kind of becomes something else. And for me, that is what's interesting, and I think I'm less, I would like to frame it less as a nostalgia for this as a time, and more as something that frames a completely other way of thinking about design, and also the role of information and so on. But I would like to kind of, in my own thing, I don't want it to come across as being all about nostalgia. I think it should be more about the question of design, yeah. But of course there's that element of it. I mean, there are a lot of very interesting and weird things in this material. The space program.
Well, not the space program, but this kind of ideal and the use of the space program for propaganda purposes, etc. I mean, all nations do that, but I mean,
Yeah.
was this what period does your exhibition span?
Well, I think the thrust of the exhibition is really this very short moment in which the space program was really seen as a kind of how would you say it, a sort of a kind of moment in which it sort of authorized the project of communism, or that it sort of reinforced that this was the ideal way, and that this was the best system in which to advance the human race. And I think that's very, very interesting, because very quickly I think people became quite bored with this whole thing. Also, of course, when they realized that it didn't really have a lot of impact on their daily lives beyond a certain level. And I think there's some interesting footage of some of the later celebrations where everyone actually seems quite bored. So when I think the third or fourth guy comes back and they go through the same kind of procedure, everyone is sort of yawning, and it's quite interesting, because it shows that it's a really very short moment, I think, in which there was really this kind of massive explosion of utopian kind of association with this project.
I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about a comparison to similar kinds of images in the U.S. space program. The thought that popped into my head is that in the American space program, there's all this emphasis upon the mission, upon like 2 or 3 or even 4 people in space at the same time collaborating. And in the images you showed, it was always kind of emphasis upon the single cosmonaut, the figure, which is really counterintuitive, because you would think the communists would be interested in teamwork and the Americans would be interested in the individual, but it's almost the opposite. So I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about the kind of comparative study between these iconographies.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's very difficult to make comparisons between the American program and the Soviet one, but I think what seems to be fairly common amongst various commentators on this sort of discussion between the two is that in the Soviet program, it was very much connected to a broader political ideology of achieving communism. The idea to conquer cosmic space was another sort of achievement that communism was meant to kind of make. And I think attached to that was really a broad idea of a kind of cosmic imaginary, which I tried to show a little bit of in these paintings, where you start to see these very, very kind of bizarre and very almost trippy sort of paintings of these scenes on the moon and scenes in various planets, in which this was really thought of as another site of another kind of communist society, that this would just be another site in which communism could be achieved. So I see that slightly differently from the American program, because I think it was more kind of direct in terms of the idea of a goal, of achieving a goal, which of course was defined at the beginning in the 60s and achieved at the end. And I think that goal was from my own kind of perception of it, was seen as more of a kind of end in itself, attached to a sort of competitive project. Whereas the Soviet one, at least from some of the sort of material that I've seen, was much more attached to a kind of an idea of a future society. Yeah.
But I think that if one does want to make the comparison, one really needs to see Nixon and Khrushchev in the kitchens and say that for the Americans at that point, it was the refrigerator and the domestic appliances were the place that they, at that moment, put their value, and were able to exploit what you're mentioning about the Soviet program is about being not part of daily life, whereas Nixon could say, "See, we've transformed daily life." Another observation about the American space program in terms of the imaginary, then we need to move to those photographs from the moon of the Earth, and to see the origins of the environmental movement in the imaginary of that image. So that I think that the symbolic, as you're saying, the symbolic content of the American space program was much more limited as an objective, a competitive objective, less utopian, and that if there was a utopian dimension, it occurred kind of by accident when the Americans got to the moon and looked back at the Earth.
So maybe with that question of who is the Soviet Stuart Brand, we can return to the other question of the vestibular function and disorientation, which is certain to follow the Columbia vintage waiting us outside. Thank you.